We're the two teachers.
Where school is always in session.
Today we're looking at voting rights. Andy, for most of history, political change came by the bullet. Here in democracy, it's by the ballot.
It is by the ballot, and yet it's so interesting how little about voting rights are actually listed in our premier foundational document, the Constitution. We really had to expand those voting rights mostly through formal changes of the Constitution, specifically the amendments.
Well, we know a lot of voting rights were given to the states, but the story of American government is really the story of expanding suffrage, the right to vote. And Andy, those amendments, we probably should just highlight those amendments really quickly. Certainly the 15th Amendment expanded voting for African American men following the Civil War. Huge expansion.
Well, really, it's the first time the federal government tells states how to operate elections in terms of who has to have those suffrage rights. In that case, the 15th Amendment was former slaves, former male slaves specifically.
And those progressives in the early 20th century realized that we need more people involved to guard us against those big robber barons. So you have the 17th Amendment, which extended the direct election to U.S. senators who had been appointed previously. We also have the 19th Amendment, Andy, which is one of our favorites.
And the 19th Amendment expands suffrage to women across the country. Certainly we know that some states had long allowed women to vote, but it's not until the 19th Amendment that the national government mandates that all states allow women's suffrage.
24th Amendment eliminated that evil poll tax, which was really a devious means to keep African Americans from voting by forcing them to pay before they vote in the South. That was eliminated by the 24th Amendment. And the 26th Amendment allowing our students to vote. The 26th Amendment expanding suffrage to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, really as a result of the protest movements coming out of the Vietnam War in the 60s.
And Dan, we really need to interject here that this is an example of a comparative concept called democratization. This is the idea that even though the United States was a democracy, we still strengthened that democratic institution of suffrage, of the franchise, by expanding the right to vote, both at the state level and local level, but also at the national level as well. And of course, this all relates to COVID-19, because we're seeing at the state level, states really struggling with how to conduct elections. Elections, if you look at elections as linkage institutions, linking citizens with their government, we know that a number of states have primary elections scheduled amidst the tumult of COVID-19. How do you conduct this, particularly in states that aren't set up to conduct their elections by mail or extensively by mail?
Well, we know, Andy, that COVID-19 will affect the way people vote, and political scientists use voting models to predict voting. And some of these models would be the rational choice theory. People will vote their pocketbooks. Well, clearly this crisis has affected our pocketbooks. We also know that political scientists call something a voting model retrospective, that they'll look at how candidates, politicians have done in the past to determine their vote. Clearly, this crisis will put a black eye on some politicians' faces.
Or prospective voting, the idea of which party or which candidates will help me in the future, in future prospects. And of course, we have that partisan model of voting where, hey, it doesn't matter. I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to vote for the Democratic candidates, or I'm a Republican, so I'm going to vote for the Republican candidates.
Well, remarkably, Andy, this crisis has really accentuated our partisanship and partisan voting. You've got blocks of Republicans, regardless of what this president is doing, is all in, and certainly blocks of Democrats who, regardless of any positive news coming out of the central government, is still saying not enough, bigger bailouts. This will affect voting, and it may affect voter turnout, Andy. We talk a lot about the do not versus the cannot voters.
Well, the do not voters are those voters who are legally eligible to vote, but they choose not to vote. And we know there are millions of citizens who are eligible to vote every election who choose not to vote. We know that in primary elections or midterm elections, the turnout rate, the number of do not voters, is substantially higher. But we know that in presidential elections, general elections like we're approaching in November of 2020, we typically see much higher voter turnout rates. But if those if those elections aren't held in person, or if there are obstacles, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens to voter turnout rates.
Is it safe to say, Andy, the do not voters tend to be younger? They tend to be a little bit less educated. Oftentimes they're coming from minority groups, but maybe this crisis will change some of this. We know that older people tend to vote more. We know that those in the upper income levels tend to vote more. Maybe this crisis will affect some of that. But we also have those cannot voters, those that maybe don't hold U.S. citizenship, cannot vote. But that felon idea, felons not allowed to vote in many states.
And we know that people who are institutionalized, who are in jails or prisons or mental health facilities, are also cannot voters. And when you come down to it, we know that some states have rules that make voting really difficult, particularly for hourly employees or in the middle of a health crisis, someone who has to stay at home for health reasons but wasn't able to get their absentee ballot requested on time, or maybe that county clerk's office wasn't able to send out those ballots in a timely manner. You have cannot voters too. I mean, you're right. I mean, just the legalities of voter turnout are going to be bewildering and fascinating to watch in the coming months.
Andy, the sine qua non of a healthy democracy is the ballot. With the crisis at hand, we're not sure what those ballots are going to look like this November in a very important presidential election. It may be in our mailbox. We're the two teachers.
No fancy words, no fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.